Have you ever heard demand and supply? No, it's always been supply and demand. Having said that, since we never go there in terms of saying demand and supply, we still in economics start with demand. So I wonder where the supply and demand, again, supply coming first actually comes from. And I think it has something to do with Say's law. Jean-Baptiste Say was a French economist going back into the late 18th century, early 19th century, I believe 1700s, 1800s. At any rate, Jean-Baptiste Say, in kind of the simplest terms, supply begets demand is what he put forth. And that's akin to something that you would see with like the Field of Dreams, where if you build it, they will come. If you imagine it, that's the Steve Jobs line. If you have to imagine it first before you can, before the demand kind of presents itself in terms of like the iPhones and so on and so forth. Anyhow, you get the idea. That's the rationale again behind supply and then demand. Anyway, supply and demand. So when we're looking at economic systems in terms of supply and demand, of course, with that in mind, different economic systems. Basically, we have three, maybe four systems. One, the first, and it doesn't matter the order, but we'll start with the tribal economy or barter economy. So a barter economy is we're exchanging goods and services for goods and services. And frankly, there are very few barter economies around in the world today. Maybe something along the lines of some remote areas in Africa, for example, where there won't be money exchanging hands, but goods and services exchanging hands. Nonetheless, tribal that barter and the tribal economy barter is prevalent and pervasive throughout the world today, regardless. With highly advanced countries, first world countries, however you want to call it, there's still quite a bit of barter that goes on, part because trying to avoid evade taxes, if you will, but in part it's when we're exchanging household services for other household services, or trading a freshly baked apple pie for someone cutting your grass along those lines. That's barter, okay? That's really what it comes down to, is that there's no money that's exchanging hands. And this is, again, very, very common. Regardless of the economic system, barter is prevalent. So starting from there's a broad spectrum going from command economy or communist type of a government to a free market economy. And frankly, there are neither fully communist countries nor are there fully free market economies, because even though that there are communist governments that are out there, there's still some gradation, some movement away from the edge. Except for, I shouldn't even say except for, but I imagine including such places as like a North Korea or a Cuba, and probably something moving a little bit away, but still certainly within the command economy range where you have that central government and authority, would be China. Formerly in the past, it was Russia, Soviet Union rather, and some might say that that's still the case, but you get the idea. It's where there's control at the top. And what I mean by control at the top, we're looking at the entrepreneurial function. That's probably the easiest way to look at it. The entrepreneurs are the decision makers. So again, as I've noted above, so who determines the product or the output mix? Who determines what goods and services are being provided to the household as consumer from the firm? And the flip side of that, of course, would be who determines what the resource mix or the input mix or those productive resources that are going to be employed at the firm? Who makes those decisions at the firm? And finally, the income distribution, who receives what income from the use of those productive resources, from that labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land. So in a command economy or a communist socialist type of an arrangement, that decision making is through government, an organ of the government. And so for lack of a better example, would be the Soviet Union with the Commissar. Commissar would be a board of however many people we're talking about, half dozen, dozen, what and whatnot, people that are making decisions for a variety of things, including things of an economic nature. These that they fill the role of that the entrepreneur. So you would have a board that would be making decisions as to what that product or output mix, the goods and services, are going to be provided to the household as consumer, and which of those productive resources and how many of those productive resources are going to be employed at the firm. And finally, again, who receives the goodies, the income distribution, the wages, interest, profit, rent, etc. That income, again, that's associated with the use of those productive resources. So the good part about a commissar, you have a central authority, is that you can make decisions very easily. Once you make the decision, then that's you can act upon it very, very quickly. The downside is that, quick example, if I were on that board, that commissar board, if you will, I might have different ideas about what people, I'm using air quotes here, what people actually need or what the goods and services that are going to be produced than a lot of other people, because I have different views of the world and so on and so forth. And you wouldn't want me to be in that position, and I wouldn't want me to be in that position either. Nonetheless, this is what happens within that framework of a command economy. So it's very centralized. The control, if you will, they're the ones that channel all the production through them, through their organ, through that commissar board. Conversely, the opposite end would be free market, or competitive free market is what I like to call it. But at any rate, the free market economy, that would be without government stepping in and having a role. So that would just be a relationship between the household firms, and we'll throw the international sector. Remember, there are 4 sectors that we talk about with this. So far as the circular flow is concerned: the household sector, the firms or the business sector, government sector, and the international sector, the foreign sector. So with that free market economy, we minimize government as much as possible. So of course, there's always government involvement, so you don't have a completely free market economy to start with, nor do we have a competitive free market economy. That's what I like to key on, is that competitive part, because the competitive part, of course, is wonderful for. It's nice to have a free market economy, but if you only have a few producers, there's a lot of monopoly power. I would much prefer to have a more competitive free market economy where the prices are lower, where efficiencies are gained in terms of the maximum number of goods and services being produced at the lowest price for the household as consumer, ultimately benefiting from that relationship. Anyhow, so the firm in this case, in a free market economy or some degree of free market economy, that's the role of the entrepreneur that we traditionally would see, the decision maker, the manager of the firm. So if it's a small firm, like a one-person operation, all the way up through a massive corporation like an Apple or Tesla, for example. And I forget the CEO of Apple, but Tesla, of course, would be like an Elon Musk or a William Gates, Bill Gates. I think he stepped away a bit, but he would have been with Microsoft. And of course, there's people like Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook or Meta or whatever it's called now, along with Google and so on and so forth. Those are the decision makers at the firm. They're the ones that are the deciders in chief. They're the ones that determine what products or what the output mix are going to be, what the goods and services that are going to be produced for the household as consumer. Likewise, they determine what productive resources are going to be employed, how much labor, how much capital, entrepreneurship, or land is going to be utilized by the firm in the transforming of those productive resources into those useful goods and services for the household as consumer. And also, again, that income distribution. They determine who is going to be receiving that income, how that's going to be, the funds that are acquired at the firm, how they're going to be dispersed back to the household as owner of the firm, as labor at the firm, etc. And so this is again that free market economy approach that we're looking at. And they're the ones that are, they being the entrepreneurs, they're the ones that are making those massive decisions, those life or death decisions on a daily, moment by moment basis. It's a very precarious position to have, right? Because if you make the wrong move, or if you make the wrong move too often, that's going to cause lots and lots of trouble for you. You will probably be quickly out of a job. The reality is then, so we talked about tribal economy, command economy, and that free market. The reality is that the real world is, again, it's more of a mixed economy. To one degree or another, we have some amount of government involvement. So what I like to look at is that the degree to which government is involved pushes us, the more government is involved, the closer we move toward that command economy, or that central authority, if you will. So, example, walk through the differences between the systems that are out there, from command economy, socialist systems, et cetera, all the way through to that free market capitalism. So what drives that supply and demand relationship, for example, within that free market capitalism? It is the individual. The individual are so it's like herding cats, trying to determine what direction they're going to go in, what their needs are going to be, and trying to gather as much of that population, to gather as much of them as you possibly can for the products that you need. So it's a very tough game, and it's fraught with all kinds of problems, and it requires constant attention. Just think of it like a baby. Constantly needing in need of nurturing, and trying to figure out what the or what their needs are, kind of. So this is the difficulty. The beauty of a competitive free market system is, because of this massive chaos, it does work, and it works very well, because there's instant feedback, instantaneous feedback, and if it's not addressed in a short order, you're going to be replaced. So there's that lots and lots of instantaneous feedback ongoing, and in spite of the chaos, it works very well. When I say it works very well, it works much better than a command economy, because command economy, you never know exactly what it is that people really, really need. And I'm speaking in very simplistic terms, but if you really think about it, back to what I said before, would you rather be making decisions for yourself? Or would you rather have me make a decision for you? For example, I don't want to make decisions for you, and you don't want me to make decisions for you either. So you're better off with the other system being closer to that free market economy, depending upon how much government involvement you want, you would like to have. So, having said that, and I'll just read this. So think in terms of the individual. Consider that the market as the central dispatcher of productive resources that engage in the transformation of production that gives society its useful goods and services. So that's kind of a long-winded way of looking at the role of the firm. Again, consider that the market is the central dispatcher of productive resources that engage in the transformation process. So remember, the firm is where those productive resources are transformed into useful goods and services for society. So finally, again, throughout the course, we will be continuing to look at the role of government. It plays an increasing role, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon how you look at it. So we will delve into that further as we go forward in the class. Onward we go. We talk about demand. Demand is, the reality is that we would like, if we had our choices, we would get, in economics, it's pretty straightforward. Our wants are unlimited, whereas our ability to acquire those, to meet those wants are limited. So we're limited in terms of our funding resources, our time, all the resources that you can think of, really, when it comes down to it. So what we focus on in economics is effective demand. This is that ceteris paribus notion where it's a Latin term meaning all else equal, or keeping something constant. So think about it in terms of like a physics class or something where you're keeping gravity at a constant, or you're setting it aside, you're ignoring gravity. So this is unfortunate, but this is the reality when we talk about economics. We have to kind of focus in on certain areas because there are so many wildly, I shouldn't say wildly, but there are so many variables out there that we really can't hang on to. So we try to look at things in a very narrow manner if possible, or as narrow as we possibly can to explain as much as we can. Too many words. Effective demand. What effective demand means is that we have the resources, for example, the financial resources to back up that demand. Yes, you want to buy a new vehicle. Yes, you would like to buy a nice $150,000, $200,000 vehicle, so on and so forth. But the reality is that your budget will not allow that, for most of us anyhow. But you get the idea. That's effective demand. Having the resources, and in particular, we'll just focus on the financial ceteris paribus, all else equal. We'll focus on the financial resources that are required. So how and why is the quantity demanded related, how and why is quantity demanded inversely or negatively related to the price of goods or service in question? So what we talk about in terms of demand is, if we're looking down at our graph, it's sloping downward to the right. We say that's a negative demand if we look at rise to run. So we're going down, so it's being reduced. We're moving downward and to the right. With the price axis, the vertical axis, the y-axis on the left, and the x-axis, the horizontal axis on the right, on the bottom. That is the quantity. So price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. And so in this case, we're talking about demand. And the law of demand dictates that as price goes up, the quantity demanded falls. This is an inverse relationship. Price goes up, the quantity demanded is reduced. And when we talk about quantity demanded, I just want to say this right now, and I'll be repeating this, and that is when we talk about quantity demanded, change in quantity demanded, that means movement along that demand curve, as opposed to change in demand. Change in demand is the entire curve is moving, is sliding to the right, to the left, rotating, however you want to say, it's moving somehow, some way, the entire curve, as opposed to a change in quantity demanded, which means that as again, you're moving along that demand curve, and that's driven by price and price alone. Okay. So again, I'm going through this repeatedly, so I have to make sure I make you aware of this. This is not to badger you with this, but it's really helpful in terms of trying to remember these topics, because as my instructor once told me many years ago, repetition is the mother of knowledge, and knowledge is the mother of wisdom, meaning repeat until you really have a firm understanding of these topics. They're not easy. They seem like they're pretty easy, straightforward. Oftentimes they are. Nonetheless, you do have to kind of go over these things a few times in order to gain currency, to gain some sort of mastery over the subject. Anyway, having said that, so law of demand argues that in almost all cases, with a few fleeting exceptions, that when prices fall, the quantity demanded for that good will increase. Again, ceteris paribus, all else equal. And when prices rise for that good, the quantity demanded for that good will decrease. Again, ceteris paribus, all else equal. So what this means is that when we say a few fleeting examples, yes, there are instances where the demand curve would slope upward to the right. This is something where we talk about, I won't say it right now, but there's a relationship between the substitution effect and the income effect. And an example of this would be the Giffen good, where the income effect overwhelms the substitution effect, meaning that there aren't many substitutes, and we all know what substitutes are, where you can substitute one good for another. The income effect means that the more income that you have, the more goods that you will buy, and the more that it will, you won't buy more expensive goods necessarily, but you'll buy more goods in general. And when you have both of those working in concert, you end up buying, putting your money to the best use. That's really kind of the idea behind this. So with the Giffen good, we say that the income effect overwhelms the substitution effect because the demand curve, again, typically would slope 99.99% of the time, it slopes downward to the right. As price goes down, quantity demand increases, and if price goes up, quantity demand decreases, movement along that demand curve, correct? But what happens, an example of this would have been the potato famine in Ireland. And so I'll kind of digress for a minute here to talk about that. So the potato famine in Ireland took place in, we'll say 1845 through 1847. And what basically happened was that pretty much overnight, the potato crop in Ireland failed. Ireland had seen a great population increase due to the introduction of the potato, which came from the Americas. And I think the strain of potatoes that failed, if you will, in Ireland was something that was developed in Germany. I think, but at any rate, it doesn't matter about that. It's just a little background. Basically, what happened was that potatoes were a great product for Ireland because once they grow, you put them in a dark place. Not a lot of sun in Ireland, right? I shouldn't say that, but you put it into a dark place in like a cellar or whatnot, and they last pretty much for months on end. So you would have a pretty consistent supply of food, and potato is a very healthy food in terms of being able to sustain a decent diet based on potatoes is pretty straightforward at any rate. So what happened was that a farmer would be harvesting potatoes and periodically going, because it's one of those regenerating type of a product, and you're able to grow pretty much year round in Ireland from what I understand. And you would store the potatoes, and you would have enough on kind of like chopping wood and setting it aside for wood for the fire through the winter. So they were setting aside these potatoes, and what happened was pretty much overnight the potatoes turned to mush, and they were unusable. They were not usable for people. They were not usable for feed for animals, and so there was nothing else for the citizenry, the population of Ireland to use as use for food. So typically what would happen would be that the price goes up. Law of demand says the quantity demanded goes down. The opposite happened in Ireland because so much of the food budget was based on the potato, in spite of the prices going up, because the losses of the potatoes through the potato famine. As prices rose, the demand continued to increase as well, because as you could guess, you would rightly guess, there was nothing else for the people to do but to buy the more expensive potatoes, until of course you ended up with massive migration from Ireland. That's a Giffen good. People argue as to whether or not that actually was the case, but you can imagine it at any rate. You can imagine something like that. This is not to be confused with price gouging and so on and so forth. This is something that's driven directly, specifically, only by the economic conditions. Whereas with gouging, someone is purposely going out there and causing this to happen. This is something that happened naturally, if you will, if I might put it that way. Anyhow, law of demand again. When prices rise, note again that the price is on the vertical axis, the y-axis, on the left-hand side. Upward movement equates with prices increases rather, and downward price decreases. We're talking specifically about that, about the price line, if you will, the vertical axis, the y-axis. Quantity then is on the horizontal axis, and rightward movement, it means equates with the quantity increase. Leftward, moving closer to zero, quantity decrease. So this is, again, when we talk about the law of demand, price goes up, quantity demanded is reduced, price goes down, quantity demanded is increased. Then whenever we talk about quantity demanded, that means movement along the demand curve, driven by what? Price, a change in price and price alone. Quantity demanded is a change in price, movement along the demand curve, driven by, again, price and price alone, as opposed to a change in demand, which is a shift in demand. We'll be talking about that further as well. So again, when we talk about changing quantity demanded, we say that, again, with few exceptions, the Giffen good, for example, the demand curve slopes downward to the right. As price goes down, as price goes down, quantity increases. The price is the driver behind this, is what we're really getting at. Again, this means as price falls, quantity demand increases. Conversely, then again, as prices rise, quantity demand decreases. This concept, again, is nearly, I say a lot because we're repeating a lot. Again, this is nearly universal, except for in the cases that, the aforementioned Giffen good, where it defies those two drivers that are behind that law of demand, the substitution effect and the income effect, which is what we'll be getting into now. So when the price of a good changes, let's assume it's rising in this case, while the price of other goods, again, ceteris paribus, the other goods remain constant, the buyers in the market will begin to opt for those substitute goods whose prices remain the same. And again, so long as the goods are substitutable, that they are pretty close copies of one another. A gas price, and I know there are differences in types of gas and whatnot, but in general, we're saying that if you see a gas price priced at whatever, $4 a gallon, and down the street there's the price for that gas is for gas, maybe even at the same type of a gas station, same brand name, we'll say even, is at $3.50. People are going to opt for the $3.50. You're going to be putting your effective demand is going to shift from the one location to the other location. Again, all else equal, quality, etc. This again is a very powerful notion out there. This is our driver behind competition. This is that invisible hand at work. So as the price of a good falls, all other prices remaining constant, again, that ceteris paribus. If it is as if the buyer's income increased, since more can be purchased with the same income. So it's not the amount of money that you earn; it's what your money can buy. Really, what your the goods and services that you can purchase with that money. That's the important thing. This is the driver again behind the substitution effect. So when we talk about the income effect, if the good is a normal good, again, most goods are. Most goods are not Giffen goods, right? The income effect results in buying more of the goods whose prices have fallen. So what we say then is that if you have more income, and this is one that, there are preferences. People tend to buy more steak than hamburger with higher incomes, but setting all that aside, since almost all goods are normal goods, meaning that the more income that you have, the more of those goods you'll purchase. The more income that you have, the more hamburger you'll buy, for example. And it's not, I know that there are limits, but the idea again is that with the income effect is that the more income that you have, the more normal goods, and so most all goods, more normal goods you will buy. If you have less income, then you would buy fewer of those goods. So if the price of the good rises, the income and substitution effect would then reduce that quantity demanded, hence the law of demand, which is supported by both that income effect and the substitution effect. So explicitly, when we talk about the substitution effect, when the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded decreases due to the availability of those substitutes. So it's dependent upon the substitutes and the substitutability of those substitutes. There's a lot of substituting going on here, but how good they are, the quality, how are they reasonable? Are they reasonable clones of that other of the other good? All right, that's what drives that substitution effect. And the other side of this, or the other part of this that's supporting that law of demand, is the income effect. Since all goods nearly all goods are normal goods, remember, except for such things as like the giffen good that we described, when the price of the good, rises for the good, the quantity demand is going to be reduced. And likewise, if the price falls, the quantity demanded is going to be increased. And when we say this, what we're saying is that if all else equal, if your income rises, you're going to be buying more of whatever that good is, if it's the price did not change, for example, on that good. Anyway, we arriving at the market demand curve is that we combine individual demand curves. So this is just kind of something to kind of keep in mind, because what you'll notice is that when you have increased in this quantity demanded, increased demand, what happens is it tends to flatten out that demand curve, because we're actually, that demand curve is also what's called the average revenue curve. So as we're buying more of something, meaning if there's more and more out there, more quantity that's being purchased, that's being demanded, is going to cause that, again, nothing else changing, it's going to cause that demand curve to shift. So it's going to cause a change in demand, flattening of that demand curve. Just something to keep in mind. So again, when we say that the demand curve is actually a summation, combining the individual demand curves, arriving at that demand curve, that market demand curve. So we have individual demand curves and we have market demand curves. Combining them together, the individuals, you end up with that market demand. So as we've already noted, that there's a difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded. A change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded, or a shift in the entire demand curve. A change in demand versus a movement along a constant demand curve, that's change in quantity demanded. Remember, a change in quantity demanded is driven by what? By price and price alone, versus a change in demand, which is caused by a change in anything and everything, including price. But it could be a change in the actual demand for the product, the amount of product driven by a variety of things. So for example, in this case, we're moving from D1 to D2, shrinking income, so shifting to the left, the far left, we're looking at the graph on the far left. That would be called a decrease in demand, by shifting the entire demand curve from D1 to D2 versus a change in quantity demanded. It's all about price, where we're sliding up and down that demand curve, driven by changes in price. For example, a fall in price on the left, in the middle one that we're showing here, would result in an increase in quantity demanded, moving outward so far as the horizontal is concerned, increase in the change in the quantities demanded for that product. Conversely, then, if the price rises, that would result in a decrease in that quantity demanded, moving inward, closer to the origin, sliding from the right to the left in this case. So what causes, we've already said, we know what causes a shift in quantity demanded, that's movement along demand curve. What can cause changes in that demand curve, shifting in the entire demand curve? So an example of this would be if you have more income. So if we have more income, what happens is that we will be able to buy more things, and that would cause that entire demand curve to shift. And in this case, it would shift rightward. So they would be shifting the entire demand curve. So what other factors, if you will, could cause that shift in demand? Again, we're not talking about a change in quantity demand where it's just driven by price and price alone. So we're talking about the entire demand curve shifting rightward or leftward. Income, more income, it's going to shift the demand curve rightward. An increase in quality, again, shifting the demand curve rightward, where people are looking at it, all else equal, remember, ceteris paribus. It's going to cause that demand curve to shift to the right. Or if there is a perception that the quality is not as good, it happens. Vehicles, new cars and so on and so forth, it may cause that demand curve to shift leftward if it's considered to be less quality than its substitute, if you will, right? Advertising. So what is the role of advertising? Think about it. Advertising is they're trying to get people to buy things. So with advertising costs money. So advertising, the only reason that you would spend more money is that if people would be willing to do what? Pay more for your products. So with that in mind, what we say is that if it's successful, and that's the idea behind all advertising, if it's not, then you drop it or you change your model or whatnot. Um, but if you, by adding advertising, by adding that cost, you're attempting to shift your demand curve by steepening it rather than flattening it. And what I mean by that is that you're causing the entire demand curve to rotate, if you will. So that's, just for, it could change in other ways, but in essence, rotating so that it's steeper. So it makes that demand curve steeper. And the reason that you want that is because what does the law of demand say? Price increase, prices increase and the quantity demanded is going to be reduced. So movement along the demand curve. So if you have a steeper demand curve, even if you have an increase in price, it's going to result in what? Not as much of a loss in the quantity demanded. And we'll get into the relationship, what we mean, adding another component to that shortly. But that's the objective behind advertising, to steepen that demand curve. Substitutes, on the other hand, cause the demand curve to flatten out. As we said before, when you have individual demand curves, when you add up the individual demand curves, you end up with a market demand curve. And the more players that you have in that market, the flatter will be that demand curve. And that's where the substitutes kind of come into play. Complements are goods that go together. So what happens is that, for example, let's just say the price of, well, I'll give you two examples. One, uh, peanut butter. Peanut butter and jelly go together. Whether you like peanut butter and jelly or not, you can picture peanut butter and jelly going together. So if you have peanut butter, uh, the price increases for peanut butter, that would result in what? Less of a demand for a decrease in the demand, if you will, for jelly, because there's probably, since peanut butter is more expensive, you're going to curtail the use of your peanut butter. And as a result of which, you're going to also do what? Curtail the use of your jelly that would go along with it. Expectations, weather, these are all things. Real quick one, you expect a new iPhone out there. And this is the one I always get caught up in, where you can kind of go a lot of different ways. But an example would be, there's a new iPhone coming out. And so what happens to the demand for the old iPhone? It depends. If the expectation is that the new iPhone is going to be very expensive, and it may not be filled with as many bells and whistles as you'd like, perhaps the demand for the old iPhone, the one that's being retired, it might actually increase. Again, it depends. Weather, it depends. It depends if there's going to be if you're going to end up with a good bumper crop of wheat, corn, etc., or if you get bad weather, or speaking of weather, if you have icy weather, if you're in colder climate, right? You may end up with a rough winter with using lots and lots of salt, so the demand for salt might increase, and depending upon the weather, it's just countless, numerous things. So keep this in mind. Anything and everything can shift demand, including, price, but not price would be included in that, but not price alone. Okay. Onward we go. So again, defining a demand curve, especially effective demand, many things come into account. The income distribution, who's getting that income, how much of that income is flowing back through, how robust is the economy, so that you can affect that effective demand, right? Age distribution, old people would be demanding fewer skateboards than younger people. That's crazy example, but you kind of get the idea. Life of the stock, meaning how if it's new equipment or if it's old equipment that's about ready to that's breaking down all the time. So you may demand for robots might go up as a result. New robots as opposed to retiring the old robots that are out there. Or back to the iPhone example. And again, income itself, income increases, decreases, product differentiation, etc. How you can differentiate yourself from the other products, whether through advertising, word of mouth, or in reality, if there is a difference between the products. All these things impact demand. So remember that change in demand, anything and everything, including price, change in quantity demand is just price alone. Okay, so very briefly again, when we shift demand curve, shifting the demand curve, changes in income, population, distribution, all the things that we talked about before, it causes that demand curve to shift as opposed to changing quantity demanded, which means that we're moving along that demand curve. So the effect of a change in income on a demand curve, normal goods, if you have increased income moving to the right, you're going to be consuming more, and the price and the demand curve itself is going to be shifting rightward. So the demand curve in total is going to shift rightward with an increase in income. Really straightforward, as opposed to if you have a decrease in income, it's going to cause that demand curve to shift leftwards. So again, now explaining how an increase in the number of substitutes impact the demand relationship, as we mentioned before, if we're looking at the individual demand curve, it's going to be steeper. If you combine 3 or 4 demand curves, individual demand curves or more, the more that you have, the more that you're demanding, the more that you're producing out there, however you want to look at it. I shouldn't say producing, but you get the idea. The more demand curves that you have, the flatter is going to be that overall market demand curve. And that is indicative of the substitution effect, where you have competition. Competition, so long as it's, ceteris paribus, so long as you've got relatively, so long as the substitutes are relatively substitutable, so long as they're good images of one another or versions or whatnot of one another, then it's going to result in a flattened demand curve. And with the flattened demand curve, it's going to be more price resistant, because if you're going to be raising prices, then it's going to impact that quantity demanded to a much more significant degree. So a small change in price, if you've got a very flat demand curve, is going to do what? Result in a huge drop in the quantity demanded. So advertising acts in the opposite direction so far as that substitutability is concerned. The more substitutes that you have, the flatter the demand curve. The objective of advertising is to distinguish yourself from your competition, to differentiate yourself from your competition. So in effect, removing or separating yourself in terms of, again, in terms of your competition, but differentiating yourself. So an iPhone versus an Android phone, are there differences? Yeah. Are they significant in some ways? I suppose they are. But the reality is there's the perception, perhaps, I don't know if this is always the case, but an iPhone might be superior to an Android phone. And I'm not going to get into an argument as to, if that's exactly accurate or not, but you can kind of guess that. The objective, of course, is to do what? To cause that demand curve to rotate so that you have a steeper demand curve. And with that steeper demand curve, it's going to be less price resistant in terms of that you're not going to be reducing your demand as much, your quantity demanded as much with a steeper demand curve. Hopefully you can see that, but it's something that we'll be talking about further as we go forward as well. So when we talked about we're talking about price elasticity. Now this is price elasticity. This is whenever you see the term elasticity, you can substitute sensitivity. So price sensitivity is the same thing as price elasticity of demand. So that shifting or the flattening of that demand curve. And as we noted before, that if we're increasing competition, that rotates the demand curve to a flatter position, makes it more horizontal. So it's more price elastic. So it's more price sensitive at each price level. So if price increases, it's going to result in a lot more reduction in demand than otherwise would be the case. Their reduction in quantity demand, rather, than otherwise would be the case if it were steeper. So again, when demand curve shifts to the right, price elasticity decreases with every price as well. Because again, you are sliding the demand curve to the right. And this is just talking through right now, and I'll depict this more as we kind of go forward. But just try to keep that in mind. So again, when we're talking about product differentiation, the objective is to steepen the demand curve, to reduce competition, to reduce that substitution effect. To make that less price sensitive. So we're steepening that demand curve. That's the idea of product differentiation, is that you're separating yourself from your competition, which means that if you're separating yourself in a positive way, hopefully, that's going to result in you having more price power, your ability to raise prices to do what? It's all about increasing revenue. Revenue is equal to price times quantity. That's all we're concerned about. Keep that in mind as well. So again, just walking through the relationship of how you can, how mathematically how to run this through. And I have their notes on this as well, so I won't belabor the point, but just to kind of show this, that you can show where you're at with that demand curve, with that slope in the demand curve. And it's very, very straightforward. It's simple algebra. So this is something that you definitely want to review on your own as you will, okay? So onward we go. Looking at this, when we're talking about price elasticity of demand, what is the relationship of the demand curve to its total revenue counterpart? This is one of the graphs. I'll say this repeatedly, but this representation, this graphical representation, to me is very, very important. It's important for an entrepreneur, we'll say, at a firm. They're very, very keen on trying to find out what prices that they should be charging, right? Because it's not so much the price. What they're really focusing on is that revenue. So the graph on the bottom, that hump-shaped graph on the bottom, depicts our total revenue. So looking at our demand curve up above, remember that demand curve is also the average revenue curve, by the way. And you can disregard the equilibrium price, that's irrelevant. But that would be the midpoint of this demand curve. And what that means is that is that revenue neutral point where revenue is maximized. And the way we see that is that a price of $2 per whatever it is that we're talking about, the quantity demanded is 2. So the resulting total revenue down below would be 4. So that's at the very top of that. Moving to the right, as we slope downward, by decreasing the price, yes, remember law of demand says that price decrease is going to result in more quantity demanded. So yes, it goes from 2 that were demanded to 3. Price goes down from 2 to 1. The problem with that is that total revenue is reduced from 4 to 3 and on downward. So the last point, of course, would be price at 0, then the quantity demanded is at 4, we'll say. And again, the total revenue would be 0. Moving the other way, past that midpoint, very important point to remember, the unitary elastic point, that sensitive point. We're moving beyond that revenue neutral point, if you will. Moving upward, yes, we're going to increase prices in the hopes of doing what? Increasing our revenue. But what happens is that the price goes up to $3 per whatever it is. The quantity demanded is reduced to 1, and we end up with what? Less revenue, total revenue of 3. So the objective is to do what? Is to find that it's noted as equilibrium price, but it's actually the midpoint. So we're trying to find that midpoint. We're searching for that midpoint all the time. So if we find ourselves, we don't know where we're at, honestly. For that, you can pretty much guess, but let's just say you're not exactly precisely sure of where you're at. So let's just say you're over at where the price is at $1 and the quantity is at 3. So what you do is that you say, okay, I'm going to try to raise prices. So I'm going to raise prices from $1 to $2, and that's going to, and this isn't exactly this is fine. Raising price from $1 to $2 as a result of which law of demand stipulates that you're going to be demanding less. However, what happens is that, again, all you care about is total revenue. Revenue is equal to price times quantity. Price is at $2, the quantity demanded is at 2. That goes, so your revenue goes from $3 total down below to $4. So you've increased your revenue. So now what do? You still don't know where you're at exactly. So you say, yeah, I'll try it one more time. So you raise price from $2 up to $3, and as a result of which your total revenue drops down to $3. And so you know that you've gone too far. So typically you don't know you've gone too far until you've gone too far. And that's when you would pull back to the 2. So all this sounds great, and this is a great representation of it, except for my equilibrium price that I've got thrown in there for whatever reason. But the takeaway from this is that you don't know where it's at. You have to be a price searcher to kind of find where this point is at. And on top of that, the other thing that's the other variable, remember this is ceteris paribus up until now, but in the real world, that demand curve is shifting all the time. And why is that? Because anything and everything can affect that demand curve, the shape and the placement of that demand curve. So this is shifting all the time. So you have to be aware of all of these nuances. And they're not just nuances, they can be very drastic changes that occur, right? So to reiterate this process again, when we talk about price elasticity of demand, price sensitivity to that demand curve, right? How price impacts that demand curve. If we're below the midpoint, remember the midpoint is always the midpoint. And it's changing quite often because that demand curve is changing quite often. So again, we're just looking at this at a steady state right now, and we're just stick with this. Below the midpoint, down that demand curve to the right, this is called the inelastic range. What the inelastic range means is that if you're in the inelastic range and you remain in the inelastic range, or until you reach that midpoint or the unitary elastic point or the unit elastic point, lots of different names for the same thing, that revenue neutral, where revenue is maximized, that point at which it's maximized. If you're within the inelastic range, moving up to that unitary elastic point, midpoint, etc., then you raise prices. Raise prices result in what? More revenue. As an entrepreneur, all you care about, you don't care about the price, you don't care about the quantity that you're selling, all you care about is the revenue that you're getting. You're trying to maximize, if you will, your revenue. So moving again from in the inelastic range, moving upward, closer to the unitary elastic point, by raising prices, you are going to end up with more revenue, and that's really what it's all about. So demand curve facing firm that slopes downward to the right. In all cases, if it's sloping downward to the right, the more it's sloping, the better for that firm. The steeper rather the slope, the better it is for that firm. But downward sloping demand curve indicates that there is some degree of market power or price power, meaning that you have some degree of control over pricing. You can be a price maker as opposed to a price taker, and that's something that will come up later. Anyhow, price elasticity of demand, it's the relationship of price to the quantity demanded and how it relates to total revenue is technically called the price and elasticity of demand. Anyhow, we're looking at in a mathematical sense, we're looking at the change in quantity demanded over the change in price. And so the sensitivity to that quantity demanded as it relates to the changes in price. So change in quantity demanded over that change in price. And we've walked through this repeatedly. And the one thing I want you to take away is just remember that, again, that QD1, so that's that quantity demanded 1 minus the quantity demanded 2 divided by the quantity demanded 1, or the change in the quantity demanded, over that price 1 moving to price 2, and divided by the price 1, that change in prices, you're looking at that relationship. You're trying to narrow that down to determine what that price elasticity of demand is. So once the price of the good is above the midpoint of the demand curve, the coefficient of price elasticity, or the ratio of the percentage change in the quantity demanded to the percentage change in the price that caused that change in quantity demanded, becomes less than 1. When that upper range is reached, price increases now cause total revenue to fall, and price decreases cause total revenue to increase or rise. Again, this is what the graph the graph on the left here shows those relationships. And on the left here, and this is again showing that relationship between that demand curve and the relationship with total revenue. But one last thing, when we talk about the law of one price. So what is the meaning of the law of one price, and how is it violated by price discrimination? So law of one price, that is no price discrimination unless fairly justified by cost differences. Many political jurisdictions, in many states, municipalities, etc., make price discrimination legal. Such prohibitions have been extended to international trade by trade treaties and enforceable in the court of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Often, price discrimination is masked by product differentiation. In other words, if you can hide behind advertising, if you can find some way around something like this, price discrimination is around us all the time. That's the reality, and it's a lot of this steps into the legal realm, and it's back to caveat emptor or buyer beware, because when this is another example, I should say another example of market failure, for example, but we'll be talking more about this as we go forward as well. So onward we now go to supply. So that makes sense, right? We go from supply and demand to demand and now on to supply. Anyway, what is the meaning of a firm supply relationship? Most supply curves slope upward to the right. Slope upward and they slope to the right. This is due to the expectation of higher profits driven by higher prices. Per unit cost held constant, so we're disregarding additional cost, but cost comes into play as well. We'll be seeing that later as well. Providing incentives for companies to increase the quantity of product they supply to the market, meaning the profit motive. Prices go up, that's going to cause you as a supplier to do what? To make more product. If the demand for your product increases, you're able to, prices are going to go up. And again, all else equal, price is going to go up. It's going to spur you on to what? Further production, to increase your production. That's all it's saying. It's the profit motive. In reality, however, increased production generally results in higher opportunity cost, because we can't have all we want of everything we want, right? So if you want to produce more vehicles, going back to our production possibility curve, if you want to produce more vehicles, it's going to come at a cost of something else. You're going to be taking resources away from some other area, and it's going to become more increasingly costly. So therefore, an upward sloping curve is also reflective of increased cost. Manifested again also in higher prices the further we move rightward along that supply curve. And when we say movement along the supply curve, we're talking about what? Quantity supplied. Moving up and down that supply curve, or sliding upward to the right along that supply curve, then we're talking about a changing quantity supplied as opposed to a shifting supply, moving rightward or leftward. We'll get to that in a bit too. That would be an increase or a decrease in supply, okay? Driven by, again, increase in quantity supplied is prompted by what? A change in price and price alone, all right? So anyway, I'll just read a little bit more. The scarcity of productive resource and the productivity lay behind supply. The more or limited productive resources we employ, the more expensive, the higher the price in the market for those resources. This is the case with virtually everything. The more quantity supplied, the higher the price. This holds again in almost all cases except for what we term as the backward bending supply curve, but we won't go there now. Yes, there's an exception, just like with the demand, with like a Giffen good or not normal good, if you will. We also have a situation with supply where it bends back on itself. It starts out sloping upward to the right, but it can, bends back on itself like a V. I should say, just bends back toward the price axis. And we won't go there now, but there are always exceptions to the rule. So law of supply indicates what? Price goes up, the quantity supplied is increased. A change in quantity supplied is driven by price and price alone. A change in supply is driven by innumerable things, including price, which could be thrown in there as well. So we can also show a change in quantity supplied. We can explain that verbally or mathematically in terms of simple algebra, where we're talking about what drives this positive relationship, moving rightward and upward as price increases. And this is again mathematically, and you can follow that and review it yourself. It's again pretty straightforward. So now we're on to looking at the difference again between change in quantity supplied versus a change in supply. Change in quantity supplied, this is the law of supply, states that as the price of a good increases, that all sellers will usually supply more of it, and as the price of the good decreases, that suppliers will usually sell less of it. All other things remaining constant, ceteris paribus. Again, in summary, most supply curves slope upward to the right, right? So rightward movement is equal to a quantity increase, back to our graphical representation where we have our quantity on the horizontal or the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. So rightward movement, quantity increase, leftward movement, quantity decrease. The firm's quantity supplied is associated positively with the price of the product, so it's a positive relationship, sloping upward to the right. So the rise to run, that slope is positive. The scarcity of productive resources and their productivity also lie behind that supply curve. So there's a lot of things that are in action behind that supply curve. The more limited productive resources we employ, the more expensive or the higher the price in the market for the resource. This is the case again with virtually everything. The more quantity supplied, the higher the price. This holds again in almost all cases, again, except for that backward bending supply curve of labor in particular, but it could be any of the other productive resources. Anyhow, that's kind of a summary wrap up of supply. So looking at it again with the quantity supplied graphically, I put them both together on the same page here, so this is good. Is that we're sloping upward to the right. So if the prices increase going from $1 to $2 to $3, that quantity supplied is going to increase. It's going to, more is going to be produced because the prices are higher. Also at the same time, don't forget that the more you move behind that supply curve, it includes what? Cost. So this is also something reflective. Supply curve could be considered a cost curve, something to keep in mind. Onward, so change in supply, when we talk about a change in supply, we're shifting supply, so shifting supply from S1 to S2, that would be a decrease in supply. So this is something to remember, to keep in mind. So movement, we're talking about the entire supply curve shifting. Rightward, leftward, it keeps the same shape, could change shape as well, but regardless, if we're moving leftward or closer to the origin, it looks like it's moving upward if you go from S1 to S2. I shouldn't even have it presented that way, but moving from S1 to S2 is actually a reduction in supply, because if you think about it, there's a line going from price over, straight line, horizontal, or I should say parallel to the horizontal axis down below, the quantity supplied axis. The first line you hit would be S2, and the second line you hit would be S1. If you drop lines down to the quantity supplied line, the quantity horizontal axis rather, the S1 is going to have greater quantity supplied than S2. So moving from S1 to S2 is a reduction in supply. So it's not shifting upward, it's shifting leftward. It's the same way with demand curve. So if you're shifting leftward, whether we're talking about supply or demand, that's a reduction in supply or demand. If we're shifting rightward in supply or demand, that's an increase, again, in supply or demand. Keep these things in mind. Just little tricks along the way, if you will. So yes, I'm meaning to repeat myself here, but we're going to do it again. Anyhow, so changing quantity supplied means that we're moving along the supply curve. It's simply moving along the supply curve driven by the change in price. So price shifting, then that's the only thing that's changing, then you're moving along that supply curve. Up and down the supply curve. Up as the price increases, downward as the price decreases. Supporting again that the law of supply. Price goes up, quantity supplied is going to increase. Likewise, when we are in the other case, a change in supply, we're talking about again a shift in supply. The entire curve is going to shift leftward or rightward. So leftward, moving closer to the origin, is a reduction in supply. Rightward, that's an increase in supply. I have up, don't get confused with the up and down. I shouldn't even have that in there. But the supply curve shifting leftward or rightward, shifting leftward closer to the origin, even though it's above the other supply curve, that's a reduction in supply. Moving rightward, even though it's below that previous supply curve, that is an increase in supply. Keep that in mind. So some of the factors affecting supply, very similar to demand, anything and everything other than what? Than price and price alone. So it would certainly, in most cases, include price, but doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Nonetheless, so a change in the cost of inputs. So is going to reduce or increase supply. Meaning, so if the cost of your inputs is reduced, that's going to increase your what? Ability to supply something. So that would be result in an increase in your supply, since you're all else equal. Since your costs have gone down, you're going to be able to do what? To produce more. Change in the number of competitors. Obviously, if there are more competitors, that's going to do what? Increase supply. If there's a reduction in the number of competitors, and we like that as a business owner or as an entrepreneur, we like the idea of fewer competitors. That's going to cause a reduction in supply, which necessarily would typically drive prices up. We won't go there, but you get the idea. Change in the size of your production facility. If you expand the size of your production facility, presumably the reason that you're expanding the size of your production facility or improving the production facility is to be more efficient, to be able to produce more of whatever that product is. So if you're increasing the size of the facility, you're increasing production or increasing supply. Conversely, if you're reducing it, oftentimes it would be for whatever reason, but in this case, we're going to be reducing supply could be the case. Change in the weather. If we have great harvest, that's going to increase the supply of that product, of that farm product. And conversely, if we have terrible weather, it could reduce the supply. Think about it in terms of the potatoes in Ireland and the famine, right? You have a famine, it's going to drastically reduce the supply that's available out there. Improvements in technology. Think about this for a minute. Why do we employ technology? We're trying to increase our efficiency at the firm, maximize the number of goods and services, and reduce our cost at the firm to the greatest degree possible. Otherwise, we don't want to employ that technology. Technology oftentimes fails. So it's a hit or miss type of arrangement. When we hit upon something that actually works, then we tend to adopt that, and the reason that we adopt it is because we're reducing our costs, and improvements in technology, therefore, on the whole, would result in what? Increased supply. Taxes are a cost to the firm initially, right? Taxes or costs to the firm go up, then supply is going to be reduced. To reduce the taxes on the firm, that's going to increase supply. Government subsidies are odd ones because if you think about it, if you're a farmer and you're guaranteed a price of, we'll say $6 a bushel for your corn, and the market price is $5 a bushel, that means that you're only fetching $5 a bushel for your corn, but with that subsidy it gets up to $6. So what are you going to do? You're going to produce more. So government subsidies encourage farmers in this case to produce more corn, right? A lot of other things that happen, but that's kind of on the face what we're talking about with supply. So now it's time to bring supply and demand together. Now, just backing up, this was something that Alfred Marshall, a noted British economist, probably one of the most famous economists, top 5, 10, whatever, economists that have ever, walked the face of the earth. I don't know. But anyway, so Alfred Marshall is a very, very famous British economist. He trained Keynes, who was also anyhow. Marshall was a very, very famous British economist. So he was the first one to come up with this concept, formally come up with the concept of supply and demand. And what that means is that where the two come together, that's scissors. It was called. That was the term that it was used. That he was talking about that as a scissors at that where the fulcrum, whatever the point, the scissors where it kind of comes together. That was that equilibrium point. So the equilibrium point is where supply and demand cross. So that is where you have supply and demand. They are equal to each other. The quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied at that given price. And that again is where we have that the coming together of that equilibrium point in the market. And I like to look at it as the point where both supplier and demander are equally satisfied or dissatisfied. So you reach that meeting point where the supplier would like to have it higher prices and the demand side would like to have it at lower prices, but that is the point where they're both satisfied one way or the other. And it's a very important point because markets, when we talk about markets, we talk about supply and demand. This is, we encounter these on a daily basis, dozens and dozens of times around the world, probably millions of times, wherever markets come into play, whether we're talking about buying something in the supermarket or buying gasoline or purchasing something online or anything and everything, there's a market for it. When we're talking about stock markets and commodities markets, and again, the list is endless. But supply and demand again is where that equilibrium point is at, where supply and demand cross, where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded at that given price. All right. So onward we move. Now we're just going to be talking through this. So we're talking about surpluses and shortages and price floors and price ceilings and what all these are. So when we talk about surpluses, first, if we're looking at a supply-demand relationship, remember that equilibrium point is where both quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, where they are both equal. A surplus exists when the price is above that equilibrium point. So if you take that price line sliding across, the first line you encounter would be the demand curve. So the demand curve, you would get the associated quantity demanded, and you continue on rightward until you cross the supply curve, and that's when you drop that down, you get the quantity supplied. Quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. So how do we get back to that equilibrium point? Because that's where the market wants to be, back at that equilibrium point. So this is where price becomes a rationalizing has a rationalizing impact on the relationship, as it pretty much always does. But at any rate, it's going by reducing the price. By having a sale, you're going to get rid of that excess merchandise, that surplus, that extra inventory that you have. You're going to get rid of it by by selling it at a lower price, and that's going to drive the market back to that equilibrium point as more buyers come in and purchase those goods and services that we're talking about. Conversely, a shortage is below, a line going across below that equilibrium point. So if you can see that, starting again from the price line, so the price is lower, so that you're going horizontally across, the first line that you hit is going to be the supply curve. So you drop a line down, and that is the quantity supplied. Continue on to the right, you find the demand is greater, the quantity demanded is greater, excuse me, than the quantity supplied. So how do you rectify this? How do you get that back to equilibrium? Yes, through the pricing mechanism, rationalizing it through the pricing mechanism, making the change through the pricing mechanism by raising prices, getting them back up. So we've seen this often as well. If you're buying a vehicle, during COVID, for example, new vehicles were hard to come by. So oftentimes the price of the sticker price will be on the car, the MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price, would be the starting point. Typically is. In a normal environment, that is the point from which you go down to arrive at the negotiated equilibrium price. But during COVID, it was the opposite. It was below that equilibrium point. So prices started there and they rose from there. This is, again, that pricing mechanism so far as surpluses and shortages to get us back to that equilibrium point. So price floors and price ceilings. So price floors would be, this is government stepping in because society says, well, that equilibrium price is not satisfactory. That equilibrium wage rate, for example, is not satisfactory. So what do? We want it to be higher. So we put in place a price floor, meaning that the price cannot go below that point. So same idea as with surpluses and shortages. So if we're with a surplus in this case, we're talking about, remember, we're looking at labor. So we're not looking at the typical household as consumer. Now we're looking at the household as owner of the productive resource, labor. So going across, the first line that we hit would be the demand for that labor at that higher price. And it has to be the effective minimum wage, meaning that if it's a wage above that equilibrium point that truly is that equilibrium, that rather that I should say the minimum wage price above that that quote unquote equilibrium wage is actually accurate, reflected what's really going on, then that would be the effective minimum wage is correct, the one that they're setting it above that equilibrium point. At any rate, I'm going around in circles with this, but very straightforward. You draw a line across from whatever that price is at above that that equilibrium point. The first line you encounter, of course, is a demand curve, the demand for that labor. Drop a line down, you arrive at the quantity demanded. Continue on over, you get to supply. Drop a line down, you've got the quantity supplied. Excuse me. And what you'll notice is that the quantity demanded far exceeds the quantity supplied. So there's a problem. What we have is a government reinforced, in this case, surplus of labor that would be out there. So there's the problem that's associated with that is that the reason that employers don't want to pay that don't want to pay that is not because they don't want to, is because they can't. They're unable to employ as much labor, so they've got to do something else with their productive resource mix. They would turn more toward perhaps some sort of a capital, more robots, and so anyways, you get the idea. As opposed to price ceiling, that would be below, set below the equilibrium point. And price ceilings, examples of price ceilings would be such things as rent control, where you can't charge any higher rent than whatever that price is stipulated by government. And the problem with rent control, with price ceilings, is that if, again, you take the price line, you go across, the first line you encounter is a supply curve. Drop a line down, you get the quantity supplied, but you have to continue on over to the right where you hit the demand curve, drop a line down, quantity demanded. Quantity demanded increase is greater, significantly greater than the quantity supplied. So as a result of which there's a mismatch. And this is a problem. Anyhow, these are government reinforced. When we talk about such things as rent control is a classic example of that. So I just went through this in words, and now I'm going to show you graphically what I mean by that. So this is what we see here is a picture of a surplus. So surplus, again, the price is above that equilibrium point, and as a result of which, if you go across that line and where that price is at, horizontally, parallel to the quantity line down below, the first line you encounter would be the demand curve. So that would show the quantity demanded. Drop that down to the quantity line, the horizontal quantity line, and then continue on over to supply curve. Drop a line down, you have the quantity supplied. And so with the surplus, you have supply much greater than, in this case, it's easy to see, much greater than that quantity demanded. So in order to clear that additional inventory, because you're supplying too much, you're building too much, in order to clear out that inventory, you have to do what? Have sales. So you discount your prices. You've got to drop your prices to get us back to that equilibrium point so that you have the effective demand to clean up that mess. So we just showed the surplus. Now we're showing a price floor. Price floor is something that's set. The prices are set, if you will, by government. And the reason, in this case, we're looking at a minimum wage, an effective minimum wage, meaning that this is effectively above that equilibrium point. As a result of which this is something that's put in place by government. And the first line that we encounter is the demand curve for labor. In this case, we're talking about the productive resource labor. So we're looking at it, flipping it around. The household as a supplier of those productive resources, and the firm being the demander for this productive resource labor. So the demand for that labor from the firms is noted where the line drops down to the quantity, the horizontal axis quantity, and you continue on over to the supply curve, supplied by the household in this case, far exceeds the quantity demanded. So there's a mismatch. And as a result of which, because it's not that firms don't want to hire more people, it's just that they can't afford this minimum wage. And it's not an indictment against minimum wage or anything. It's just saying this is the reality. We're looking at the real world so far as economics is concerned. So that higher wage, as a result of which the employer is going to hire less labor, and it's going to opt to do something different so far as that productive resources are concerned in order to what? To keep their costs down, because that's what it's all about for a firm, is to keep that cost down, unless they're able to do what? Pass those prices along to the household as consumer. Difficult to do, especially if you have a very competitive environment, but we won't go there. So this is what we call price floor. Price floor and surpluses have the same effect, except that I have the same image, if you will, but the difference, of course, is that surpluses are cleared by reducing prices, and price floors are purposely placed where they're placed by government. Now we'll just kind of shortcut here. We'll show shortages and also price ceilings. They have the same. They're very similar in the way they look. The difference, of course, is that shortages are the first line you cross is the quantity supplied line. The second line is the demand. The quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So in order to rectify that, you would have to raise prices to encourage what? So the supply to increase until you reach that equilibrium point. So again, this is that price rationalization, that pricing, where it causes this movement to get us back to equilibrium, because that's where markets want to be at equilibrium. And always bearing in mind that equilibrium is always shifting, because yes, the demand curve is always shifting, the supply curve is always shifting. Anyway, having said that, that's the objective, is to try to move us back to that equilibrium. Rent control is an example of a price ceiling, meaning that you're not allowed, through legislative actions in the government or some other government policy, where you cannot raise prices beyond that level. The problem with that is that if the first line you encounter is a supply curve again, and the second one that you encounter is a demand curve. So the quantity supplied is less, or the quantity demanded, if you will, is greater than the quantity supplied. So the way that you could rectify that, of course, is by allowing prices to rise, but you can't when you have a price ceiling. That's as high as you can go. So this is why you oftentimes have massive shortages in housing in areas where where there are effective price ceilings. In places like New York, very common. New York, I think LA, parts of LA have rent control. I'm not sure. San Francisco certainly had rent control. That may or may not still be the case. But the problem again with price ceilings is that you're forcing your the good thing about it is that it sounds good on the surface. Yeah, you're going to keep prices down. The bad part of it is that you're going to be denying access to many people as a result. So there's some unintended consequences that are maybe they're unintended, but they are certainly foreseeable. And this is the problem when you have government intervention in the form of price ceilings, rent control, and price floors in terms of effective minimum wages. And it's political. So economic policy drives these things. So this is what society wants, but the problem is that there's a price to pay for that always. So again, so long as markets are competitive, a shortage will force the equilibrium upward again to that equilibrium price. So it's again that price is going to be causing that increase, that rationalization, that causing the movement is by raising prices, you're going to cause the supply to increase as a result. So what do we mean by the downward price rigidity? So in a normal market situation, when products don't sell in goods and service market, this would result in a surplus. In order to clear that surplus in the markets, the price firms would typically fall back to the prices would drive the production back to that equilibrium level. If firms have market power, they're able to restrict supply. This is really where the pricing mechanism comes into play when you have market power or price power. The way you raise prices, if you have this, and that's the only way you can really truly raise prices, if you have market power, is to reduce supply. If you want to raise prices, if you want to reduce prices, you can increase supply, but we won't go there. As a firm, if you have your choice, you'd rather raise prices. Again, assuming you're in the inelastic range and you want to increase your revenue, which they all do. So by shifting that supply curve leftward, closer to the origin, what you'll notice is that, say for example, if you're at S1 and the demand associated with S1, at that point you were at the equilibrium point. Excuse me, not at the you're at the equilibrium point, supply demand, but you're at the midpoint, if you will, so far as the price elasticity of demand is concerned. If you shift your supply leftward or reduce supply, that's going to push that midpoint up higher. And as a result of which you have much greater ability to what? To raise prices in order to increase your revenue. Or to increase your revenue, you're able to raise prices. This is the driver because it's all about what? Increasing your revenue. So this is what we talk about downward price rigidity. You've got the power to raise prices. You have the power to influence this. So that steeper that demand curve, or that by shifting that supply curve inward, in essence, you're able to do what? You're able to increase your revenue. Okay, so I'm just going to interject here with a little history lesson, and this would have been in the Great Depression. So what happened in the Great Depression was that the economy went into recession. So there were actually two recessions during the Great Depression, which ran from 1929 through, people say about 1930 1940, but some others say, no, it actually went through the end of World War II for a variety of reasons. But at any rate, so Great Depression, what happened was that demand collapsed. Demand collapsed because they lost their jobs and the stock market collapsed and so on and so forth. And as a result of which they did not have the income, and since they didn't have the income, they were unable to buy things, and if they weren't unable to buy things, it caused this massive disruption in that circular flow. And demand, as a result, shifted. It fell. It went left. It dropped. It went to the left. It moved closer to the origin. So shifting from D1 to D2. So as a result of which, what would happen typically by shifting from D1 to D2, you would probably have a decrease in prices to offset that, to get us back, to get to, going back to that point, you'd have a reduction in prices. But what happened was, again, as a result of because you would have you would end up with a surplus, right? You're producing and you're not cutting back, and you would end up with a surplus, and because you would have a surplus, you would reduce your prices in order to clear the surplus. But what happened was that a lot of this was political machinations, and some was just the desire by firms to operate in this manner. But we'll just say Ford Motor Company, for example, rather than reduce prices, what they opted to do was to reduce supply, so that they would be able to continue to maintain that same price level, to maintain that same profitability again, if you will, to even though they would have a reduced footprint, reduced revenue, they would still be able to sell their vehicles for the same price. So this is kind of what happened in the Great Depression, was that we'd had this fall off in demand, but we also had a significant fall off in supply. Rather than reducing to having price reductions, prices stayed pretty much the same, at least so far as a lot of, like in the auto industry, prices at least initially stayed pretty much the same, and we ended up with this just a smaller, much smaller economy as a result. And it was all about maintaining that market power, maintaining price power. And Ford, for example, would have done just that. That was kind of the example that we have. So it's pretty insidious, and there were a lot of problems that resulted. But this is, again, just graphically kind of what happened, if you will. Up, so now we're blank, but that's the end of the presentation, folks. And thanks for bearing with. It was quite extended, quite long. But thanks again for hanging in there.